I think there's a real problem here with the dishonesty of the British state. They're not being honest with the public, and until we actually confront the issue, which is Muslim fundamentalism, we're not going to get any closer to a solution. This is not
Why?
about Facebook. This is not
Yeah,
about.
no, exactly. Mark Zuckerberg can't do anything about this, Douglas, can he? That's where I'm at as well. Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK, where the channel that asks you to think more and follow less. So please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's free thinking content. In today's recording, I'm going to be discussing events in both the UK and the US. I'll find out what my guest thinks about the state of politics in Britain, the response to the murder of David Amess, the MP, and the vomit-inducing slogan of building back better. I'm delighted to say that guest is Douglas Carswell. Now, Douglas Carswell is a Brexit hero, one of the founders of the official Vote Leave campaign, an all-round sound chap, in my view, who's gone now to take the fight for freedom to the United States of America as the president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. Hi, Douglas, how are you doing?
Darren, hi, greetings from America. It's wonderful to be on your show.
Oh, how is it in America? What's it like at the minute? Are you sort of free? You can roll about and, you're not wearing masks and all the rest of it?
It is wonderful. In this part of America, I can't speak for all of it, but in this part of America, it's completely free. There are no mask mandates, but if you run a shop or a business and you want your customers to wear masks, you can ask them. And so people work it out on their own. And
Yeah.
it means that people assess their own risk. If, like me, you've had the vaccine and you regard yourself as low risk, life carries on as normal. It's truly wonderful.
Yeah. Now, Douglas, a lot's happened since we last spoke on this channel last summer during the height of the Black Lives Matter riots. Now, before we discuss what's going on in the US, I wonder if we might turn to issues here closer to home. As you know, last week we heard events that frankly made my blood run cold. I don't know about you, but I fear, Douglas, that the murder, a senseless murder of your former colleague, no less, David Amess, the response has been, oh, well, we need to ensure that there are no anonymous accounts on Twitter. We need to get rid of nasty content on there. That'll deal with the issue. And I don't know about you, but I'm left sort of thinking, what? What universe are these people living in? A suspected Islamic extremist wielding a blade stabbed an elected representative of the British people 17 times, Douglas. And now you tweeted, I think, a really, really quite thoughtful tweet where you said, I genuinely worry about the UK political culture. A member of parliament is murdered by a suspected Muslim extremist, and 48 hours later, the political debate is about banning anonymous Twitter accounts. Now, that tweet struck me because I don't think you're alone in thinking this, Douglas. What do you think's going on here? Amess wasn't killed by nasty tweets, was he?
As far as we know, the suspect didn't even have a Twitter account. So, first of all, I was deeply shocked, as many people were, by the news about the murder of David Amess. And I was particularly shocked because, as a fellow Essex MP, I knew David pretty well. And as a fellow Brexiteer, I got to know him pretty well. I was also pretty shocked because, having been a Member of Parliament in Essex, I've had numerous surgeries. And there's something very mundane and everyday about having a surgery. And the idea that someone could turn up at an MP's surgery and murder them in this way, I mean, it just made my blood run cold. But rather than face the issue, which is the murderous intent of a Muslim extremist, apparently, allegedly, rather than face that reality, what the political class in Britain seems to be doing is a form of mass delusion. They're picking up on something quite different. Now, as a Member of Parliament, I came across a great deal of abuse on social media. I got a great deal of it, particularly being a UKIP candidate in a number of elections. You can imagine the sort of vitriol that I was exposed to on social media. But however unpleasant that might be, I never felt it was murderous. I don't really think the feelings and the proper more of MPs who don't like anonymous abuse is really the issue here. The issue here is Why is it that some people have been so radicalized by the teachings of Said Qutb and others that they feel that in pursuit of a theological dream, they can murder people who represent liberal Western democracy? The issue here is, what is it that we're going to do to stop them? Because this has happened before. After the Parsons Green attempted mass atrocity, after the Manchester bombing, which resulted in the killing and murder of young teenage children, after numerous incidents, the British state almost goes into a form of denial. They want to make us believe that the issue here is the mental health of the perpetrator. It took a long time, for example, for officials to even admit that the series of homophobic attacks in central Birmingham were caused by Islamic radicals rather than anything else.
Yeah.
So I think there's a real problem here with the dishonesty of the British state. They're not being honest with the public. And until we actually confront the issue, which is Muslim fundamentalism, we're not going to get any closer to a solution. This is not about Facebook. This is not about...
No, exactly. Mark Zuckerberg can't do anything about this, Douglas, can he? That's where I'm at as well. And I'm sort of thinking here as well, why is it that that one issue around Islam, you can't discuss that. You can't discuss the fact that there are some, I think the suspect in this case, and I should stress he is still a suspect, was 25-year-old. Now, Douglas, that's a young man, right? And it seems to be young men. And we've got this problem here where people are coming over the English Channel, right? And we don't know who's coming over here. We have no idea.
I think there are two issues. There's the superficiality and the stupidity of the British political establishment, who are unable to address the issue. And that is one problem. But then there is the problem itself. And the problem itself is fundamentally this. Western society doesn't like to point out that some forms of culture are superior to others. We're so indoctrinated in the idea of cultural relativism, we're so led to believe that all cultures are of equal worth, that we're unable to face the fact that actually some cultures are superior to other cultures. So when we have in the West a non-Western culture, rather than insist upon a degree of assimilation, we, because we want to be cultural relativists, we kid ourselves that this other culture is as good as Western culture. I would argue that actually the root cause of the problem is Western fondness for cultural relativism. But I think we need to reject cultural relativism, because cultural relativism is false for several reasons. Not all cultures are the same. Some cultures are better at securing the equal treatment of women. Some cultures are better at achieving equal treatment for gay people under the law. Some cultures are better at producing innovation like powered flight and the iPhone. Some cultures are better at producing medicine like COVID vaccinations and others. The pretense that all cultures are the same is the root cause of the problem. If you believe that all cultures are the same, you can't possibly believe that it's possible for a culture to improve itself over time. I would argue that Western culture is far better now than it was 50, 100 years ago. We have better treatment for minorities, better treatment for women in the West. The root cause of this problem is Western difficulty in contemplating the reality of cultural relativism. We need to recognize the fact that if people are going to come and live in the West, they need to accept Western norms. There needs to be a question of cultural compatibility when we talk about immigration. And no one wants to talk about cultural compatibility. Not all cultures are the same. Not all people coming into the West from outside the West can be as easily assimilated. But if the West does not believe in its own cultural virtue, the chances of it being able to assimilate people from outside the West are nil. And the problem will persist. The West needs to wake up. Western culture is a superior way of life. That is why people want to come and live in the West.
Well, that's
people
true.
want to live in the West because the Western way of life is a better way. And we in the West need to wake up to that, and we need to begin to assert that reality in our own backyard.
Douglas, what do you think there are parallels? Do you think there are similarities between what's happening at the southern border in the United States and what's happening at the southern border, indeed in the United Kingdom or in England? In that
I
we
think
have
I think
these two borders that, they can't be policed almost. It seems like politicians have just said, I give up, right? I just
I,
give up.
I mean, I think Europe is in a far, far, far more serious situation than the United States. The Mediterranean may be physically wider than the Rio Grande, but when people move into the United States from the southern border, and I know this causes great outrage and ill feeling in the United States, but you've got people who are essentially coming from a culture that I think makes it far easier for them to become Americans. And I think one of the most striking things that I've discovered in the year or so that I've been living in America is the extraordinary success of second and third generation and first generation Hispanic Americans in becoming American. There's this hugely successful Hispanic middle class in America now. And I suspect that actually it's people may complain about the scale of immigration, and they're right to. People may complain about the mass movement of people and the failure of the federal government to control the border. But fundamentally, long term, I believe the American dream, the American melting pot, will address these issues. What I worry about is Europe, where
A lot
cultural
of the
relativism.
Hispanic community as well, Douglas, did actually vote for Donald Trump, right? That went against the sort of the media's narrative at the time.
I mean, what is so striking to me as a Brit looking at America through fresh eyes is the extent to which the middle class Hispanic Americans are becoming Americans in all sorts of ways. They're voting Republican, they've got Trump bumper stickers, they're running businesses, they're doing all sorts of things that middle class Americans from Polish backgrounds and Irish backgrounds and all sorts of backgrounds do. They're becoming American, right? And America's done this incredibly successfully before. In 100 years ago, for example, there was great debate about Italian Americans becoming American, and I don't think anyone today would, for a moment, question the success of America in creating genuine patriotism amongst people, irrespective of where their grandparents and great grandparents came from. This is the great success of America, because America believes in America. I know the East Coast elites don't always do so, but in most of America, there's this extraordinary cultural self-confidence, and it's very attractive. As a recent arrival to America, I am thrilled at the prospect of celebrating Thanksgiving as a recent arrival. Okay, I got here, 240 years too late, but it's wonderful to be here. But I worry about Europe. Europe has nothing like America's cultural confidence. Europe has nothing like this unashamed and decent patriotism that they have here in the United States. I worry about the cultural compatibility of those arriving in Europe to become Frenchmen or Brits or Germans. If European cultures don't believe in themselves, why on earth should a first or second generation arrival integrate? This is the root cause of the problem. And no one in Britain wants to talk about it. They'd much rather talk about algorithms on Facebook and anonymity on Twitter. But these are absurd conversations to be having. We need to have a profound and fundamental question about culture, assimilation, and integration if Europe is to be a success the way the United States is.
Well, all I can say is after hearing you say that, we are at a loss without your contribution in that House of Commons, Douglas. But moving slightly on, I think as a one-time Tory MP, which you were, would you have backed Boris Johnson as leader were he to have been a candidate at that time?
Absolutely. I mean, my main reason for standing for election was to secure what today we call Brexit, to get Britain out of the European Union. And I, alongside you, campaigned as part of Vote Leave and that general sort of broad coalition. And it was wonderful, wasn't it, to savor that moment of victory. There was then that extraordinary period where, through bungling incompetence, various protagonists in the Vote Leave camp managed to fail to agree amongst each other as to what should happen next. And they ended up installing by default the worst prime minister we've ever had in British history, Theresa May. And she bungled her way through her negotiations. Eventually, she was replaced. And it was a joy to see her replaced by Boris, who then delivered Brexit. And any leaver who wasn't in favour of Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister, I mean, I suspect, you just look at the result in many of those traditional Labour voting seats that were voted for Boris. it was wonderful to see him elected Prime Minister, but it was a mandate to get on with Brexit. I think there are a whole bunch of other things that this government has done that I think are a cause of great concern. We seem to be returning to some of the traditional socialist policies of the 1970s, and not altogether a happy experience for Britain. We seem to be spending money in Britain like a drunken sailor. We seem in Britain to be posturing around the world with brand new naval ships, but we don't seem to actually have the means to defend our border where it matters in the English Channel. I think the fundamentals of British statecraft at many levels, whether it's the fiscal incontinence of the Treasury or the misaligned defence priorities of our armed forces, many of these problems, I think, are deep and systemic, and they require really grown-up government. Brexit meant Britain secured self-government. I think we have yet to work out how best to govern ourselves or who best should be governing us.
Unquestionably true. I mean, would you agree with those that argue, actually, you know, Boris has sort of, the articles he used to write about being a sort of, I guess, libertarian-minded conservative have sort of gone out the window since the introduction of Mrs. Carrie Johnson into his life? Do you think that sort of the whackery and wokery that Boris seems to be very much champion of is down to that new relationship? Do you think it's that simple?
I don't want to have a dig at Boris because, for a number of reasons, I think he deserves respect and credit. I'm going to make a broader point. I think one of the reasons why the British political establishment is suffering from this malaise is because there's something incredibly meretricious and superficial about it. Ask yourself why it is that a columnist who writes a newspaper column can enter high office in the first place. Instead of being the exception, it's become the norm. No criticism of Boris, but he was a former newspaper columnist. So too was Michael Gove. In fact, many of the leading figures within the Tory party were former journalists. Now, nothing wrong with that, but doesn't it suggest there's something rather superficial and meretricious if you are recruiting from the media commentariat your statesman? It's no coincidence that Margaret Thatcher was a chemist by training. Many of the greatest leaders that we've had in Britain, I think, have done something pretty significant as a senator. Now, you may say Churchill was a journalist too. Yes, he was, but he was also a soldier and a serious writer and a serious thinker. It's that word seriousness that's lacking. There's something altogether too superficial about the people that we manage to select to be MPs in audible seats, that we select to be in the cabinet, and that we then select for high office. I don't think there's any simple remedy, but I think we need to ask ourselves, if we're to be a serious country, we need, I think, to be able to draw into the body politic people who've actually done concrete things rather than just written newspaper columns.
It's an interesting point. I mean, what do you think then of this push for net zero? And it's not just a UK phenomenon, as you well know. I think of the Green movement, Douglas, as being a fundamentally anti-democratic one. I think that's evidenced in this country in the spin-off from Extinction Rebellion. You must have seen the clips of Insulate Britain blocking off some of our busiest roads, refusing to allow ambulances to get to their destinations, and children being unable to get to school in their mother's car. Things like this with very frustrated people. And it's also, I think, an anti-democratic movement in the way in which they advocate these joke people's assemblies, but then they say, well, if the People's Assembly votes the wrong way, well, we'll just ignore that and ask them to vote again. And despite this, I think, quite extreme approach to politics, it seems to have been adopted with gusto by not just the politicians, but by the civil service as well. Are you concerned about that trend?
If we want to understand, and many of your viewers will probably be asking themselves, where did this obsession with this eco-belief system come from? I think the only way, you described it as anti-democratic, I think a more useful way of thinking about it is to think of it as a post-religious religion for the political elite. If you go back 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, most of our political leaders had a religious belief, in many cases, a Christian conviction. If you look at the diary entries that Ronald Reagan wrote, if you look at some of the private thoughts of Margaret Thatcher, if you look at many of the great socialist leaders Britain produced over the past century, they all shared a religious conviction. The only way to really understand the green movement that is afflicting the Western elites is to understand that many of them are post-religious, by which many of them don't actually have a Christian or other faith system at all. Now, into that vacuum comes the belief in the environmental agenda. It serves as a religion to them, number one, because it gives them a belief system. It gives them purpose. It gives meaning to their wielding of power. They can feel virtue by banning the use of one-time drinking straws, or declaring that as a result of their action, the world will be a purer, literally a purer place. It also allows them to position themselves center stage. Political elites have needed a belief system that legitimizes their exercise of power over their fellow human being. And the Green Movement does this. It empowers the civil service and the administrative state on both sides of the Atlantic and legitimizes the wielding of this extraordinary power. So I think we need to think of this as a consequence of the religious nihilism of the political elite. I wonder if perhaps in the late Roman Empire, when a series of cults began to take off, if we're going through a similar process. I think perhaps Western elites like to think of themselves as rational, but what they're doing is clutching for a post-religious belief system. And when they meet at this eco summit in Scotland in a few weeks, think of them as the leaders of a cult, gathering to draw succor from each other and to proselytize and to advocate a belief system that empowers them and puts them center stage. That's how we should think of them. Now, I think reason and rationality don't come into it. There's no rationale or reason in what they do. Many of the policies they pursue are self-contradictory. They, in the name of creating a more environmentally friendly planet, required us to all switch to diesel cars. How did that work out? In the name of making ourselves carbon net zero, what we're doing is offshoring the processes that produce the carbon to Asian countries. Think about that. It's absurd to have a manufacturing supply chain that emits the same amount of carbon, but the carbon is emitted in Asia, which allows you in the West to say, look, we're net zero. By any objective measure, what they're doing is irrational, illogical, and delusional. But I'm afraid that's what kind of happens when you believe in a cult in place of an organized religious belief system. And that is what we're witnessing. I think will also ultimately lead to a moral collapse of our governing elites, because they will only be able to justify what they're doing with reference to a system of thinking that is fundamentally flawed. But don't, like with many religious cults, don't expect them to be reasoned with. Just because it doesn't work, it doesn't mean that the eco-loons that govern us are going to desist, sadly.
Would you, as a co-founder of Vote Leave, would you support a straight sort of yes or no referendum on pursuing net zero by 2050? Do you think that would be a good idea? No,
I wouldn't. I would never invite a country to vote on its economic suicide. I think that is what you're talking about. I mean, the simple fact is, the reason why you and I are living with the standard of living most of your ancestors and my ancestors for the past 6,000-7,000 years, Darren, have had to work every hour of daylight in a field, backbreaking work, just to produce enough calories to survive the next day. And often people didn't produce enough and they starved. Along comes the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is an energy revolution because humans for the first time are able to generate energy. The Dutch start with wind, the English then move on with coal, and we use these energy sources to create an agricultural and an industrial revolution. Fundamentally, if you inhibit the ability of us to burn fossil fuels to produce energy, you inhibit our ability to live well. Now, if you live well already because you're part of the elite and you're a trustafarian, it's pretty selfish for you to try to deny others to have the kind of lifestyle that you want. We see this sort of hypocrisy, by the way, in Scotland in the next few days. These are people who don't want mass air travel because they think it will pollute the environment. I can't help noticing they're flying to Scotland in private jets to preach austerity to the world.
John Kerry flies everywhere, doesn't he? Even to Obama's birthday party in a private jet. It is quite extraordinary. I wonder then, with all that in mind, with all this sort of the idea that politically, and I certainly feel this, Douglas, a bit lost, really. And I get this time and again, the number of emails I get from people or the comments on YouTube saying, I feel politically homeless at the moment. Do you think there is any genuine alternative in Britain?
Darren, the fundamental problem that we face in politics is that the party that I suspect you and I would have once naturally voted for, which was, when I say the Liberal Party, I don't mean liberal in the American sense. For the benefit of any American viewers, I don't mean liberal like Biden. I mean liberal in the sense of free market, laissez-faire, free thinking. That party, which I suspect you and I would have supported unquestioningly, was forced to merge with the patrician landowning Tory toffs because of the advent of the organised Labour Party in the 20s and 30s. This was a great tragedy of British politics. I always hoped that with Brexit, the party of organised Labour would be ultimately defeated and destroyed in perpetuity. And I think that may well happen. You see this great schism between the values of the Labour Party membership and the traditional Labour supporters. The woke agenda just simply doesn't resonate with. In fact, it repulses people on the doorstep in towns like Darlington. But I think the only real solution long term, so that people like you and I have a political home, is the revival of what you might call a Gladstonian.com political movement. I hope that will come about. Mm-hmm. I hope the internet will catalyze this development. But those of us who believe that basically human affairs are best left to self-order, I think are essentially politically homeless, because politics at the moment is dominated by people who have a blueprint to boss us around and tell us how to live our lives. And I'm afraid, at the moment it's a choice between a socialist democratic blueprint and a socialist democratic blueprint. It's not much of a choice.
So you don't think then we can all find a sort of political home in UKIP now, with former Tory MP Neil Hamilton leading the party?
I don't want to be disrespectful to the party that I was once a member of. There are good people in it, but UKIP came together, a bit like Vote Leave, to achieve a single issue. We were very successful, you might say, given that we only ever had 2 MPs elected to the House of Commons, and we achieved our objective. You could say we're the most successful party in British political history. But UKIP can't be a vehicle for malcontents forever. What you need is a movement within the Tory party fold to reassert the values of Margaret Thatcher, of William Gladstone. It could happen. I fundamentally believe that the internet is going to be a force for the dispersal of certainly power, but even also authority. What we're witnessing in the Western world now is basically a modern version of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. The internet and social media are like the printing press. They come along, they democratize the forming of opinion. We're seeing the Counter-Reformation now with the tech giants led by people like the former Prime Minister Nick Clegg and Facebook, trying to control what the peasants are allowed to say and do and think. I'm sure that if I was to mention certain subjects on this broadcast, we would find ourselves automatically vetoed by some of the social media platforms. But the Counter-Reformation was unsuccessful, and this tech Counter-Reformation will ultimately prove unsuccessful. I hope that with the democratization of opinion, you get the rebirth of the kind of political vehicle that you and I so crave. Mm.
Yes. And I mean, I wonder then if we move to the United States, which isn't very difficult for you right now, but your new home, this sort of latest battleground for freedom for you personally, Douglas, I wonder you're someone who's passionate about the teaching of economics, I think it's fair to say, and I think you advocate a firm bit of fiscal restraint. Are you therefore alarmed by the Build Back Better agenda, in which the American public are being told that the borrowing won't cost them a penny, Douglas? There's a sort of money tree or a printing press that's going to sort everything out. I wonder if you can just watch this clip of the White House press secretary and then respond to what it is that she's actually saying and why she's fundamentally, if not mistaken, being a little bit fast with the truth as far as America's economics is concerned.
The president still believes that Build Back Better will not add a dime to the national debt?
Correct, it won't.
Why should Americans believe that?
Because it won't. Go ahead.
What if taxes that he says he wants to get more taxes in? What if it doesn't happen? What if the economy goes sour? Lots of things can happen. You're going to tell from up there future generations, not even born yet, that they're not on the hook for this. Is that right?
That's right, and hopefully you'll report accurate information yourself.
So Douglas, what was inaccurate about that statement?
Listening to the White House press secretary, what she's saying is literally incredible. It lacks credibility. The idea that this huge fiscal splurge is not going to add to the debt, not going to add a dime. I don't think she believes what she's saying. And I think she recognizes that the audience doesn't believe what she's saying. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're the person in the White House who's responsible for defending what the president does, it's a pretty difficult job, right? It was pretty difficult under the previous guy, and it's pretty difficult now. But it's just not credible that this isn't going to increase America's national debt. I think one of the most frightening things happening in the global economy at the moment is the extent to which the American federal government is spending money that it simply doesn't have. It can do that partly by borrowing, but fundamentally it's creating more dollars. A huge percentage of the number of dollars in circulation today have only come into existence in the past 24 months. This is going to lead to inflation. We're already starting to see this. I think if you really want to understand what the market thinks about the management of America's finances and the long-term viability of the post-Bretton Woods fiat dollar as a reserve currency, just look at the price of Bitcoin in dollar terms, or look at the price of a barrel of oil in dollar terms. I think that tells you what real sentiment, not White House press spokesmen, think about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to be put in charge of finance in either here or the US, I guess, actually, because I think there are a lot of similarities between the two agendas. As far as that Build Back Better platform is concerned, they're both pro-central planning as far as the green stuff's concerned. They're both borrowing vast sums. They're both hiking up taxation, yet saying that they're not going to do that. They're very, I think, SDP or social democratic in nature. So what is it that you would do? Yeah, exactly. It's this sort of, it is that, isn't it? It's very statist.
I know the cliche on both sides of the Atlantic is the same, build back better, but what it really should say is building more government. That's what this is about. The idea that America can only prosper if the government is building things is absurd. It's that way of thinking that has got Europe into the mess that Europe is in. America has always had a competitive advantage and been the center of global innovation precisely because it had a constitution that prevented its government in DC from thinking that it was the government's responsibility to grow the economy. Building back better means more officialdom. It means more bureaucrats. It means higher taxes to pay for more. It means government in Washington subsidizing. It means more corporate welfare, corporate handouts, corporate subsidy. It's not great news for the average American. The average American, since I've been here, has seen the price of petrol, gasoline going up. The price of everyday groceries in the food shops has gone up. America is not in anything like the precarious energy situation that Europe has managed to get herself in. But even in America, there are going to be Americans who are unable to afford to keep their homes warm this winter. And this has happened on the watch of a government that is spending money supposedly to provide mass prosperity. It's not providing mass prosperity. It's good news for government officials on the gravy train in DC. It is disastrous for average Americans who don't have enough dollars to get by.
I mean, to end then, Douglas, I wonder if you might summarise for us, in an age when I think politicians can't answer whether or not women have a cervix, they can't speak, as we've already discussed, about Islamic terrorism, and they parrot these lines or slogans like "Build Back Better" at us ad nauseum. Are there any reasons, and you have been for a long time now, I guess, a source of, I can listen to you and feel better about the world, because I remember what the world has been capable of in the past. I remember what the fruits of liberalism, and by that, again, I don't mean the big L liberalism of America, but the classical liberalism of our past and of America's past, indeed America's Constitution, as you say. I remember all those things, and I'm reminded of those things. Are there any reasons to be optimistic at a time when our priorities seem way off at the moment, at this moment when, China is testing missiles that are reportedly capable, I'm sure you'll have seen this, of travelling through space? Is there anything at all to be optimistic about as far as the West's future is concerned?
Take heart, and take heart for two reasons. The first reason is we've been here before. In the 1970s, the West was run by people who seemed incompetent and inept. Ted Heath and Jimmy Carter. They presided over a series of foreign policy disasters, particularly Jimmy Carter and Iran. Like in the 1970s, anti-Western powers were in the ascendancy. It wasn't China then, it was the Soviets who marched into Afghanistan. People in the 1970s talked about America being in terminal economic decline. They talked about America as being the past. They genuinely believed that Japan was going to overtake and eclipse the United States economy. But look what happened. A small group of people, led by Friedman and Thatcher and Reagan, restored and revived the West. America, far from disintegrating into the Rust Belt, created technologies and industries that we didn't even know about in the 1970s, the whole digital revolution. Now, we've been here before. We mustn't worry too much about geopolitics. China's going to have its own internal contradictions that bring it down. What we need to focus on in the West is keeping alive the things that make the West exceptional. That belief in liberty, low taxes, small government, and freedom. That is our secret sauce. That's the secret in the Western culture's DNA that makes it able to innovate and reinvent itself and stay ahead. So don't lose heart. We can do that again. Things looked infinitely worse in the 70s compared to how they look today. And we revived if we stayed true by staying true to those principles. The other reason why I think we've got to remain optimistic is, well, optimism is a force magnifier. Being optimistic is the best way to win this argument. Too often conservatives are pessimistic, and that, I think, has often been their undoing. But, we have no choice but to be optimistic, because there is no better way of life than this Western way of life. And if we lose that, then the world will be a grim and dark and desolate place. The world is a better place because of the United States and because of Western culture and Western values and Western hegemony. The West must rediscover that truth and must believe in that truth and reinforce the values that make the West the best place in the world to want to live. The fact that so many people want to come to the West, I think, is everyday vindication of what is so special about our way of life. Let's preserve it.
Yeah.
The alternative is just too grim to think.
Absolutely. Douglas, if people want to find out more about the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, where can they do so?
Well, we're a state-level think tank. I believe the way to revive America is not to try to change it from DC, but at a state level. And that's what we're trying to do here. We are one of America's most prestigious state think tanks. We have a website, mspolicy.org, or look on the website. If you want to, just email me directly. We're very active on social media. We want to connect with liberty-minded people, with happy warriors, with people who share our values, but above all, our optimism. We can win this. But, the great innovations in America always come from the state. Ronald Reagan, state governor. I'm convinced the next Ronald Reagan is out there somewhere. Maybe not here in Mississippi, but they're out there somewhere.
Thank you very much for your time, Douglas.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to be on your show, and God bless to all of your listeners.
Now, if you enjoyed that, as I'm sure you did, absolutely positive you did, please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching this video. Reasoned is a grassroots organisation that's entirely funded by people like yourself. So if you're in a position to do so, please do consider supporting us by clicking the link to the side there.